Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. We'll be spending the next couple of hours talking to the guides about ancient civilizations and how some of the things that happened in ancient times apply to our modern world that we live in today. As I always say, Micheila is a trans channel, so we'll be speaking directly to the guides, but I don't discuss these questions with her or the topics beforehand just to make sure her conscious mind doesn't interfere in any way. And also on YouTube, it seems like we don't have a problem with advertisements for the moment, but they have started deleting some of our videos. So if you want to follow us on some of the other platforms like Rumble or Spotify or iTunes or rather Apple Podcasts, that may be a good idea. At some point, we may not be on YouTube, so just to keep that in mind. And of course, some of the videos that are deleted will be on Rumble instead of YouTube. So we're ready to get started whenever you are. Last time we left off talking about the Naga and the reptilians and dragons and how that applied to this ancient timeline that we discussed before. But who are we speaking with this time? The same council as always?
There are many who have assembled, including the Council of Light, as well as an ancient council of elders from Atlantis, known as the Naacal.
I actually do want to talk to the Naacal in the future and more in depth as we get into some of the Atlantean timelines more in detail. I want to pick up this time where we left off in that we sort of left off with how the Naga were interacting with the Annunaki and the around the time of the Great Flood and that cataclysm that occurred at that time. And what we established was that there was in previous shows, we established the Anunnaki timeline is the timeline that we're still walking today from ancient times. Last time we discussed how the reptilians or the Naga also coexisted with the Anunnaki in ancient times as well as since 13,000 years. What I want to understand, though, before we continue is in previous shows when we were discussing the Anunnaki, we discussed how they came to Earth, entered the fifth dimension, and they all of the ancient stories of Enlil and Enki primarily took place prior to 13,000 years ago in the fifth dimension, and then the cataclysm occurred about 13,000 years ago, at which point we descended into the third dimension. But that Anunnaki timeline is the one that continued into the third dimension, and that's why we see a lot of Anunnaki iconography around the world, like the use of the eagle or Garuda. Now, last time we discussed how the Naga or the reptilians also coexisted with the Anunnaki in the fifth dimension, or rather they were in the third dimension, and how they were interacting to some degree because the third dimension is close enough to the fifth dimension. Just like today, we have human beings who are third dimensional and also fifth dimensional, who interact, but not in any significant, meaningful way. Now, what I want to establish, though, is when we discuss the cataclysm that moved the Anunnaki from the fifth dimension to the third dimension that's existed in this timeline since 13,000 years ago, did the Naga also, that third dimensional Naga collective or race that was coexisting with the Anunnaki, is it fair to assume that they also made that transition from that timeline with the Anunnaki into the new third dimensional timeline?
Some of them did, yes. And this is how we can rectify this answer or idea, because when you are all choosing the same planet, even though timelines you create may exist in different dimensions, through universal law, there is always going to be an effect of every single timeline simultaneously when a cataclysmic event of this nature takes place. And it's because so many souls on the planet in number were involved in that experience, meaning they were lending some vibrational input. So it can be described very similarly as what you are walking today. In other words, many of you assume to already exist in the fifth dimension, and for the most part, you do. However, It is the entire collective that that is lending its energy to the future trajectory of that fifth dimension, even if they are not in it, because you are all somewhat tied together in a collective and unified matrix of energy, regardless of how much you acknowledge it or it is understood.
Okay, so some of the Naga did transition then into the third dimension along with the Anunnaki. So, and some did not. Is that what I'm understanding correctly?
That's an accurate statement, yes.
Okay. And so is it fair to say that the world or the civilization in which we live today, in this current third moving into fifth dimension, that this was founded upon? We established in previous conversations about the Anunnaki how the civilization today is largely founded upon the beginnings of what they inserted into not only our genetics, but also into our society 13,000 years ago and prior to that. Is it fair to say that Naga also instilled some of their nature or intentions into this timeline, reality, and society that we live today as well?
Well, of course, many have. And what you're experiencing is a blending of those timelines as one. What we want to take you back to is some of our previous explanations about the spiral of time and how events like this come back around. Because to say that you are on the same timeline wouldn't be a completely accurate statement, because as timelines continue on, there are many new ones that branch off, and they are often influenced by the energy that was before. So you are all here as creators, and through your perception and through your consciousness, as these events repeat and come back around, you're either transforming them in some very important way, or you're replaying them simply by reassembling the various pieces of the puzzle into a new landscape. And ultimately, much of the iconography that we discussed in our previous gathering is evidence that your consciousness and vibration is tapping into the ancient history of that timeline again, and somehow reconfiguring it in a modern application.
So to sort of restate what you're saying, timelines do change, and so we can't say exactly that this is a continuation of that original timeline. Yet there are some influences and inspiration that has imparted into modern society, and the iconography is just an example of how we can see that in a visual way. And and you're also saying the fact that we're noticing that iconography shows that we're tapping into that, into those timelines, correct?
There will always be some physical demonstration of synchronicity, in other words, as to how history is impacting the creative energy of the beings who have currently incarnated. And that is the best and most accurate definition we can offer.
There's a lot of iconography also of snakes and different reptilian types of beings. For example, dragons are also appear in China or in England, for example. Dragons seem to be very prevalent as iconography. Not so much in the U.S., but we do see snake iconography even in ancient Egypt as well, in headdresses and other uses, hieroglyphics and things like that. And of course, we even see snake iconography in the U.S. as well today. And so is it fair to assume that the snake iconography is representative of this reptilian lineage from when the apocalypse occurred 13,000 years ago?
Some of it is. Of course, we cannot say for certain that every representation of a dragon or a snake is the same influence or meaning, because if we look at what many of the more enlightened beings that you call Naga were here to teach, we might say that this is representative of the breath of fire, as we have spoken of, which has been transposed into many spiritual modalities and meditative practices, or the amplification of life force through the rays of Kundalini, which has also been represented in many ancient civilizations through the imagery of the snake. But ultimately, we could say that all of these things tie back to the Naga that you speak of.
A lot of the iconography that I've noticed from for even ancient times, and now there are a lot of storylines from ancient times of how the Naga interacted with the Anunnaki. And it seems like some of it might have been positive. And as we discussed before, you did say that it was positive and sometimes also negative. It seems like sometimes they were fighting with each other, or not necessarily fighting with each other, but fighting to for dominance over human beings, or who would get worshipped. And we discussed in the last conversation that YAHWEH was a collective of reptilian beings. Am I correct in that understanding so far?
Yes, we agree with what you're saying.
Okay. And also, YAHWEH is described in the Bible as being surrounded by seraph. And seraph is a word that actually means serpent. And also in the biblical term, or in the biblical text, it seems to suggest that these seraphs were either breathing fire or setting things on fire on behalf of YAHWEH. Or now maybe YAHWEH was the whole group of them, and the seraph were just the people who were being led by a central figure in that reptilian group. Is that what the structure was essentially?
Well, let's take you back to some of the explanations that we brought forth in our previous time together, and remind you of what the idea of the breath of fire or the fire-breathing dragon actually stems from. It is the alchemy of intergalactic beings who had great power and control over their own energy fields, and perhaps not in the highest and best intentions always of using those tools for the betterment of the ones who were receiving, on the receiving end of them, in other words. So we agree with what you're saying in terms of the seraph and in terms of the snake and much of what the story tells. But we want you to remember that there are a lot of generalizations and symbology in the stories that have been left behind. And you, as conscious beings, are drawing these historic accounts through the translation of your own vibration, meaning that sometimes the readiness of a collective to receive the literal meaning of a story from ancient times comes about when the dimension has been raised enough to bring it into a higher state. Because ultimately, if we are to say that all of the beings in this collective were negatively focused, it would be just as linear as saying every human being has some malevolent force within them. Any consolidation of beings in a collective, of course, is based on some similar intent. And sometimes that intention is to rule by fear, such that the beings who are being ruled are subjected to various philosophies and dogma and ways of being. And this is certainly what we believe is more representative of the story that is being told.
All right, when you're using the term collective just now, are you referring to YAHWEH, the collective, or the larger reptilian collective?
Well, we think sometimes they can be seen as one and the same, or shifting between one another, in other words. But yes, we agree.
Okay. So YAHWEH, the collective, was benevolent and also malevolent at different times. So it's a mix of both. Is that my understanding?
Well, let's explain it this way. Sometimes the intention of gods or hybrids or collectives who had come to a physical planet seemed to them to be in the highest and best intention, such that they could direct what they thought were the best actions for a planet in need, when in fact it was not in the collective's best interest at all. So intent is an interesting word, because sometimes even on the physical plane, human beings do not fully connect with or understand their intent for doing the things that come natural to them, or have been led astray of their own inner connection to act without pause. So many of the beings in this collective may have also been led astray by others to believe they were acting in the best interest of the human collective, when in fact they were not.
So when we hear stories in the Bible, and I know the Bible has been translated and a lot of the original meaning is lost, but I want to try to narrow down where there may be some accuracy so we can have a basis for understanding the story. So when we hear stories of Yahweh and the seraph causing destruction in different areas, setting things on fire, burning entire cities to the ground, and wiping out entire civilizations of human beings, was that, and so that was, as we were talking about the breath of fire, they're referred to as breathing fire or setting things on fire. So if I'm understanding correctly, they were using the breath of fire, which is not physical fire, but rather prana to create these results. For example, using prana to set something on fire or to destroy an entire city. Is that correct?
Well, we don't want the fire analogy to be taken too literally, because we'll take you back to some of the explanation that we have offered about the construction of pyramids, for example. In many of the formations of these pyramids in ancient times, light ships came in and were directing energetic technologies to alchemize elements and to change landforms and to bring things into perfect symmetry. And evidence of this is left behind today. Even though this may have been completed through the presence of a plasma ship, many of these beings that you refer to had the plasmic ability to do the very same thing without the presence of a ship at all. So some of what may have been considered destruction was actually an attempt to shift the Earth's frequency and to change various landforms and masses to be reconstructed in a better suited way to their presence, in other words. And this destruction, even though we're calling it alchemy, wasn't necessarily well received by those who existed in human form on the planet at that time, because they had worked very hard, obviously, to settle in communities and to create a flow of currency and energy and resource between one another. What these beings had most in mind was to strip humans away from their autonomy or their ability to use what they had created for their own benefit, such that they would rely on the gods and teachers that were not human at all.
Okay, so in some instances this was done for benevolent purposes. But for example, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it is said that Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because he didn't like what was happening there, and the people weren't worshiping him. So in that instance, was it a literal destruction of a civilization?
It was a literal destruction of a civilization, yes, for the purpose of rebirthing that civilization. Because remember, there is a DNA influence here as well. Even though we could provide a lot of insight as to why an act of this nature isn't actually conducive to what a god or a collective like this would have wanted, because even though an entire civilization is wiped off of the planet, everything that they've created, their energetic input into the time grid, never truly goes away. So yes, we agree with what you're saying, but perhaps what we want to add is that it didn't actually have the effect that these beings or gods desired.
Okay, so this particular collective of beings we refer to as Yahweh, reptilian beings. Their intention was to wipe out the civilization in order to get rid of the pattern or the signature genetic pattern that existed. But in so doing, nothing changed because the pattern still continued to exist and just recreated itself.
Exactly.
Now, going back to 13,000 years, we emerge into the current timeline with the Anunnaki and the reptilian or Naga timeline continuing forward. The Atlantean timeline came to an end, or rather, the timeline didn't come to an end, but Atlantis came to an end in the ninth dimension. And we also saw some individuals from Atlantis, like Thoth, for example, make the leap into the new Earth dimension on the third dimension, fifth dimension time period, 13,000 years ago. So we started about 13,000 years ago with Anunnaki, with the Naga reptilians, and also some Atlanteans. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So somehow society at that time became a blend of these three things, these three ideas. Were there any other influences that were present?
There are always other influences that are present, but the statement we'd like to make is that these three primary influences became more the norm than those who were attempting to push up against them.
Now, one thing that I see in the iconography that I think is because I've been wondering for a long time, the snake iconography, because in some uses in different parts of the world and even in the United States, it seems to be used in a negative context. But in other uses, it seems to be in a positive context. But one thing that seems to be unique about it that is different from the Anunnaki. So I want to sort of differentiate the two. So let me just talk about this for a moment. You can tell me if I'm on the right track. It seems to me that the Anunnaki lineage, or what they contributed to modern society, is the more technological aspects of it, the focus on money and wealth and power, for example. Whereas it seems like the Naga reptilian race was not so much on the technology side, but they seem to have been focused more on the spiritual. For example, even the malevolent reptilians used the breath of fire, where I don't see that sort of reference when it comes to the Anunnaki. It seems like they were primarily on a technological basis, using portals and different technologies to do what they did. Is that correct so far?
Well, we can simplify this by saying that the technology could be looked at as the primary focus in both, except the definition of technology was completely different, in that the Anunnaki were focusing on technologies outside of the self, and the reptilians were more focused on the structure and technology of the being that they existed within.
Okay, so the reptilians and the Naga being more of a mind-based focus, the higher mind, at least when they originally came here. Their development was more internal technology then. And so when we see things in the world that are more of an internal technology, such as meditation or pranic practice, for example, those are primarily of the Naga reptilian lineage, whether used for positive or negative. And when we refer to the Anunnaki, we're referring to, we're seeing the parts of society that are more of the other kinds of technology that we would consider more technology today. External technology, even electronics that we use today, might be a lineage of the Anunnaki from ancient times. In addition, the Anunnaki seem to have more focused on things like gold and wealth and power and kingship and things like that, where the Nagas and the reptilians seem to have focused on religion and spirituality and worship of others. Is that so? A lot of the religions, I think, like Christianity, come from them. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, we agree. We also want to add that there are many contributions from the Anunnaki that are not so advanced in their technological presentation as they are today. For example, the frequency of sound or cymatics and the use of that as a technology is something that the Anunnaki initially brought to planet Earth.
And I would imagine that a lot of the things that they constructed in ancient times, in stone or otherwise, were using vibration or frequency, cymatics as an example.
Yes, and with the addition of various elemental properties and crystal, for example.
Now, when I look at modern day religions and from 13,000 years ago till now, it seems to me that there were two distinct forks that occurred in religious direction, from which many different religious modalities sprung from. But it seems like the Anunnaki primarily fueled a lot of the religions that are based on Kabbalah or different kinds of magical practices. So many of the Jewish religions, for example, or Islamic religions, perhaps, seem to have sprung from that. And actually, the Anunnaki supposedly inhabited that part of the world primarily. And then we have this second aspect of religion, which seems to come from the reptilian side, which from there I see things like Christianity and Catholicism, although Catholicism is a blend of many things, and also Buddhism and such. Am I on the right track with that?
Somewhat, although we cannot generalize as specifically as you are, and want to remind you of that interface between the Anunnaki and the reptilians at certain points in their evolution, because some of these ideas have actually been shared between them. If we look at what the Anunnaki may have created in consideration of the Kabbalah and magic, some of this may overlap with the beliefs and the teachings of the reptilians, but not necessarily in a more negative sense, because the geometric configurations of the universe exist within many of the magical symbology that these beings were using. And much of what the reptilians came to teach was how we were all a part of universal energy. We were not separate but one. And to have that understanding is very powerful, because it can be used for good, or it can be used for the benefit of those who see its power.
So when you say symbolism, are you referring to things like, for example, the cross seems to have originated with the Anunnaki, but yet it's also used in Christianity? Is that, or even the swastika, for example, seems to have originated with, it's hard to say. The swastika seems to be a blend, possibly, of both Anunnaki and reptilian. Am I understanding correctly?
Well, many of the groups that you're speaking of right now would have taken their insights and understandings of these various symbols and added their own influence to them, because they understood that any symbol from ancient times that was powerful could be directed through their personal influence and prayers, and to change it ever so slightly would add their own unique interpretation to be utilized as a focal point for certain practices of divination. So certainly you are going to notice some overlap in these various activities, and taking things from one period of ancient history and somehow installing them into another.
In a lot of ancient writings, it seems to suggest that the Templar cross is something that originated with the Anunnaki, possibly representing the 4 different regions that they inhabited. Is that correct, or is there some sort of spiritual significance to that?
But we would say it's a modification of that, not necessarily a direct relationship to the Anunnaki bloodline, because this order, we'll call it, did have Anunnaki human hybrid beings as a part of its original elder councils, for example. And so these ideas were lent to the origins and beginnings of the order's, we'll say, instruction manuals and symbology that it created. slightly different, but still carrying the same history, frequency, and intentions.
When we go back to some of the ancient temples in India. Now, in India, it seems like the Naga were more heavily represented in their iconography and in their spiritual temples and so on, where you don't see Annunaki in India, in the Indian temples. You see Nagas, you see different Indian gods like Krishna or Vishnu and so on, where in the Middle East area, you see more Mesopotamian gods or even different Anunnaki gods are worshipped in that area. So was that because the Naga or the reptilian race were more focused in the Indian, Cambodian, that region?
Well, if we take this to the highest level, what happens in ancient times happens still yet today is that those souls with a similar divine plan, vibration, dimension, and intention will magnetize each other in various regions to have specific experiences. But also we must keep in mind that the Naga, for example, were seeking out regions of solace, areas where there were not influencers that had gone before them who may have totally corrupted the people, because they were bringing new insights, teachings that had never been heard before. And their goal was not that they be shared in the same linear fashion. These geographic regions where the Naga prevail were the birthing sites of many other master teachers and enlightened ones who carried these visions and ideas, philosophies even, into new civilizations and cultures. So yes, we agree with what you're saying in terms of the regions that these beings chose, but perhaps what we're saying is they weren't really physically or mindfully chosen at all. They were a magnet to those who were meant to be there.
Now, one thing that I find, we discussed previously about how Thoth actually influenced many of the pyramid structures around the world, including in Mexico, even though those pyramids were also constructed with the interaction of a reptilian god, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkhan, for example. But there is a distinct difference I see between the architectural styles of even Mexico, the Mexican pyramids and the Egyptian pyramids versus the architectural styles of the ancient sites in India. The difference primarily, or one of the main differences, is the architectural styles in India from ancient sites are very intricate. They're very detailed and extremely artistic. And in terms of the visual design, extremely sophisticated compared to the other ones, which it seems like have much more of a clean, simpler design with not much of any iconography or design work, and other than the purely functional aspects of what it was. Now, was that because Thoth was not involved in the architecture in, for example, the various sites in India that were probably Anunnaki oriented?
Well, if we look at the sites,
I'm sorry, I meant Naga. Yes.
We look at the sites that are in India that may have been influenced by the Naga. The differences are based on several different foundational ideas. First, the Naga were very interested in the vibrational impact of everything that they were either constructing or somehow non-physically creating. And we might not think as physical beings on a human planet that the intricate design and beauty of anything would have an impact or an energetic influence on all that intersect with it. But certainly It does. And these details were not just for the purpose of vibration alone. Within these temples and pyramids, for example, there are entire volumes of history and stories that are carved within stone. So what you're noticing are, we'll say, very meticulously planned architectural designs that not only influence the vibration of the space in which the structure was created, but also tell a story in an astral sense. These pyramids were designed such that those who entered would receive the download of energy straight from the consciousness of the pyramid itself. And those that constructed them believed it was important to include these things as a part of its design. It is similar today to a painter, for example, choosing to paint an elaborate landscape. It can be done in a very gingerly fashion, simply to show the time of day and the landform itself, or many layers upon layers can be used to show depth and dimension. And this was more the preference of the Naga to do these multidimensional designs than it was perhaps the Anunnaki, because as you have mentioned, the Anunnaki were certainly more interested in the technological aspects of these structures. Not necessarily that they weren't measuring their vibrational impact, but consider that they were not as drawn to the multidimensionality of these pieces of art or technology that the Naga were. They simply have different history and background than the Naga do. Also, we want to discuss the way that the land intersects with these various sites, because we've mentioned previously that a great deal of alchemy was used in the process of creating these very symmetrical structures. And all of the residue that fell away from the crystal and the rock and the granite that was infused within the earth became a part of the technology itself. This is why today you can visit the underground caverns and waterways and actually feel the intense vibrational power that still remains, even though there has been some degradation of the site itself. What you may notice in the intricate designs of India is that it would have taken more effort to carve them. And the Naga understood. They had patience in this process because it would give the landform around it, the landmass around it, more opportunity to absorb all that wasn't used in the process. And that is why perhaps even going well beyond the geographic or physical proximity of these pyramids can actually be felt by an individual miles and miles away, even when they are activated, for example, with a specific planetary alignment or influence. It's not to say that other pyramids do not have this quality. We're simply trying to demonstrate the difference in perspective and how certain races of beings would go about a similar type of effort with a slightly different orientation.
Now, explain to me either the mechanics or help me understand what was different about the Naga from the Anunnaki that the Naga sought solace. Now, I understand they taught things like meditation, which obviously reaches the state of solace or a state of stillness. So these are all concepts that come from the Naga or the reptilians. But what was it in them that made them seek that out versus the Anunnaki, who seemed to be much more aggressive in energy?
Well, there are many considerations for this, of course, but the main premise has to do with their higher minds, because in today's reality, many of you are struggling to control the overactive mind or there has been programming or implanting of ideas into the mind, which actually limits a soul's potential to manifest through the organic and true connection that it holds to the divine. Now, the Anunnaki definitely had a different perspective when it came to the workings of mind. As you can see, that projection went outward into various forms of technology, for example. But what the Naga knew and what they practiced was stilling the mind to such a degree that whatever was meant to be manifest through them could come to full fruition. And this was a power that they had used on their own home planet, but needed to be somewhat modified on the planet they now found themselves on. Because remember, Earth is a different atmosphere. It's a more physically dense planet, which is ultimately somewhat aligned with how reptilians are structured. Yet, those that existed on the earth were working with a very powerful connection of mind to body and mind to emotion. This is not something that the very ancient or advanced Naga were doing. In fact, they had transitioned well out of the use of an emotional body. Not to say that they were not kind and compassionate beings, but they were more empathic in a plasmic sense, meaning the ultimate knowing and understanding of who they were and what they were capable of came through the mind. It was a higher mind and more heart-centered in its alignment. So to pursue stillness or some form of solace, to them is the ultimate form of magic, because there is no consideration of any outside reality. When we go deep within ourselves, without any constriction of expectation or thought of what we should do, the universe works through us in the best way possible. And this is how they taught many others on the earth plane, and how they themselves were taught prior to coming to the planet.
All right. So is it fair to say, although there may have been benevolent reptilians and or Naga, and also malevolent reptilians or Naga, that the underlying similarity, regardless, was that they all operated from mind and higher mind, and even the more malevolent ones would have sought out solace as a result of that nature that makes them different from the Anunnaki?
Well, and this is what leads us to the next point that we did not make about your previous question, and we believe it will answer what you are asking of us. And it is a bit complex, so bear with us. But we want to take you back to the beginning of time when the reptilians came to the planet at the very beginning of humanity's seeding. Now remember, there was a hybridization process that they had to go through in order to be here. So even coming to Earth, they were not in their original state. That being said, throughout history and spanning all of these timelines leading up to where we are today in our conversation, there has been some influence to their structure as well, because on a human planet with a variety of different beings who are operating in different forms, it's inevitable that the evolutionary process is somehow going to take a being out of its true and organic state. If you are on a planet that is not your own and you are interfacing with beings who are different than you, there's going to be some genetic commonality that begins to take shape. And for the reptilians, this was a taste of what it might be like to feel. And so to feel in a physical body for a reptilian is something not desirable at all. It's something perhaps that isn't even understood or doesn't go along with their process, yet it happens nonetheless. So many of the reptilians that you're calling malevolent, for example, were in a very dire situation. Their genetic template had been skewed and their home star system and planet destroyed, and they were in preservation mode. And any being who is in the focus of self-preservation and beginning to feel as if they are not themselves, are going to act out in the most unnatural of ways. So this is a consideration that we want to add to the story, is that you have to remember that many of the more enlightened and ancient ones who are seen as teachers that you may be calling Naga, were using the techniques of breath and meditation and stillness to overcome much of what they were experiencing on the earth. And it truly was possible for them because they would effort at it. They brought so many of the techniques that they had learned from their past to the present and were capable of reintroducing them to an environment that was different and foreign, yet at modifying and translating them according to what they needed. Many of the other reptilians were not as able to do this as they were.
So there were reptilians who were not operating in a state of stillness. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. But when you go back to ancient spiritual teachings that have survived today to modern times in the form of, let's say, Buddhism or the Buddhist religion, or various practices such as meditation and chanting and Buddhist chants and things like that, did those originate with the Naga?
Many of them, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And other ones were just created as a result of that lineage, or did they come from the Anunnaki as well?
Well, there were many hybrids present on the planet at the time. Not all of them assuming a reptilian or Anunnaki lineage. So you must consider there were influences from other star systems and planets. And the Naga were very known for transferring what may be called samadhi, an agent of transition and awakening, in which human beings who received it were contacting other planets and even parts of themselves from beyond the earth, and beginning to chant and channel themselves. But we agree with what you're saying in basic premise, is that many of these chants and meditative practices originated from the Naga.
And this is why we see the snake iconography, for example, used in the Tibetan flag as an example.
Yes, it is a representation of that lineage.
Another interesting thing that I find with the Naga or reptilians is in the previous conversation we talked about how they tended to live underground because they didn't like the nature of the surface environment that we have on the planet, and sunlight is averse to them. But I have found that there are, now in the context of them seeking solace, they do seem to have, at least based on archaeological sites around the world, located themselves in other distant areas. For example, very high on top of mountaintops and places like that were very distant from being underground, but nonetheless very solitary. And there, for example, in India, there are many local stories of Naga living in tiny populations in very high up areas in the regions where they were far away from everybody else, and they specifically put themselves there because they wanted to have that distance from other human beings and such. Is that true?
Well, it is true, and we can explain that perhaps one of the most motivating factors in this was the preservation of their own genetic template, because as we had mentioned previously, any close proximity to or interaction with another race is going to change, hybridize, and influence the beings that come to a planet that perhaps were never meant to be there. Now, the Naga who decided to live within the inner earth were seeking solace, but remember also a certain level of density, not because the earth is a dense reality in that it is a negatively oriented field, but much of the rock and crystal and various roots of forests create an environment that is very conducive to their structures. It is certainly high vibrational, while at the same time containing the dense physical energy of that vibration. A mountaintop is very much the same in that at the top of a mountain, at the very peak or the summit, there is often a very, we'll say, tangible frequency that is the culmination of all that exists below it. And that is why many of the Naga chose these locations to reside, because very much like the inner earth, it's a dense landform and coagulation of vibrational consciousness and energy that is suitable to the way in which they exist.
Now, in the Christian or Catholic text, for example, it seems like YAHWEH, the collective we discussed earlier, oftentimes seems to be at a mountaintop. For example, Moses went to the mountaintop to collect the tablets, and YAHWEH was at the top of the mountain. Is that storyline correlate to that nature?
It does. Yes, it's a correlation with the genetic preservation that we were speaking of, but also the comfort of a physical connection to a landmass of this nature.
Now, are cities like Machu Picchu, for example, which are also at very high elevation, far from anything else, was that also a Naga civilization?
It was, and the elevation is a consideration beyond what exists beneath it, because the absence of any, we'll say, inorganic vibrations is something that these beings would seek out. It is not to say that in ancient times there was the presence of toxins that you are dealing with today. Nonetheless, what you may notice is the elevation of many civilizations today that are existing in these higher mountainous ranges tend to have better health. And it isn't necessarily because of the elevation itself, but what doesn't exist at that elevation.
And what doesn't exist is what, the interaction of more human beings?
The distortion, we might say, of beings who are not living in their truest alignment.
I see. So mountaintops are better for health because the beings who tend to live there are more in alignment with a higher way of living. Is that correct?
It is correct, but also we could go on, because if you keep in mind the breath of fire, this being a technique that these beings had practiced for generations of time, the way in which they existed on a physical planet was quite different than a human. In other words, the way that you breathe today is a slower and more unnatural configuration than the way the reptilians have been taught to breathe, which isn't necessarily fast in comparison to your breath, but not necessarily in the same, we'll say, range or depth of what your breath requires.
So is it fair to say, although not obviously on the whole, that reptilians typically built their cities or villages or living areas either at very high elevations on mountains and so on, or underground, whereas the Anunnaki tended to build on the general surface of the ground in pyramid cities and other structures? Is that difference in their architectural decisions?
It is, and we agree, and we want to infuse an idea here that may be stepping ahead of where you're going, but we think it's important and would be well understood. If we look at a mountainous range, often there is a portal that exists beneath or within it. Many might understand even today in visiting a mountainous range, there is a consciousness and some access to the inner earth, whether it be for the purpose of obtaining valuable crystal or elements, or time traveling. And this was another purpose for the location of the enlightened Naga. But the Anunnaki at the ground level understood that these beings took possession of these very, we'll say, prominent gateways and access points to the inner earth. Either they were stationed there and tapping into the valuable crystal and elements available to work with, or they were somehow becoming guardians on the surface of the earth of the access points to areas that the Anunnaki would have preferred to own. And this accounts for some of the warlike tendencies between these two collectives, where the Anunnaki were very interested in using precious elements and crystal in their technologies. And many of the Naga had situated themselves in prominent locations where those elements and crystals existed.
So, and this is prevalent, it seems like, in ancient to modern iconography, where even in the U.S., in the U.S. seal or the dollar, for example, we see the iconography of the eagle, which is Anunnaki. And of course, for example, the Federal Reserve, same thing. We see the golden eagle, but then we also see in its talons a ribbon, which is sort of stylized. If we look at other countries, we see that ribbon is actually a snake or a naga of some sort. So is that suggesting this war between the two of them that was taking place?
It is, and you will continue to see this on the timeline that you exist on today until this understanding comes to light. Because if we go back to the origins of this story, we know that the basis of much of their activity had to do with the enslavement of others.
When you were talking about their activity, are we talking about the combination of the two of these, the reptilians and the Anunnaki, or are we talking about the Anunnaki?
We're speaking mainly of the Anunnaki here.
Okay. Now, we know in our previous discussions that we have a reptilian nature that also has certain negative qualities or properties as well in our modern society. So if these reptilians were known for helping us develop these teachings of higher consciousness and meditation and inner stillness and so on, breath of fire, for example, so basically inner mechanics, then how is it that that we also see this negative quality of the reptilians that is also instilled within us that causes many of the problems in the world?
Well, there are many factions of reptilians that exist on planet Earth, and these factions have hybridized within themselves. So when you speak of the Naga, you're only speaking of a very small subset of an entire race of beings that came to a planet because of a cataclysm. And many of these beings that took up their residence in the inner earth have not evolved in the direction of being enlightened teachers or respected by human beings on the planet. In fact, their presence may not even be known. Now, when we speak of your genetics, we always want to reiterate that the intention of all of those who seeded humanity was pure and love-based, even the reptilians. But any time that the evolutionary process of a race becomes somehow swayed or influenced, things begin to go awry. And this is where we could simplify, because it is, of course, a very complex story, by saying that you have been forced into a very mind-driven type of creation. And that has not been through the reptilians alone, but also influence of the Anunnaki, for example. For if you are to connect to your emotion and empathy as deeply as possible, much of what has been created on this planet would never happen again. But we can say with great regret that humans have been taken off their evolutionary timeline and are replaying some of the same stories that we have been taking account of in these transmissions. And it is not just through a reptilian influence that this has happened. Yet the hybridization process perhaps needs to be brought into this conversation, because when you have been hybridized away from the pureness of your genetic template, meaning there's an imbalance somewhere and your structure is defaulting to a way of being that is not natural for you. Ultimately, things are going to go awry. And that for humanity has been sovereignty, the understanding of individual power, but also how it is tied to collective consciousness and unity. So we could say that there is a reptilian consciousness that you have been unfortunately dealing with. And it isn't necessarily reptilian only. We use this term widely to represent an inability to see beyond the self and to believe in the autonomy of the creator that you are.
When you use the term reptilian influence, we're not referring necessarily to reptilians or the Naga themselves. You're referring to, I guess what I'm trying to understand here is, where does that nature come from? Is it the reptilian nature to look within that creates that sort of ego sense in society today?
Not necessarily, but we understand where you're going with this question, because while the reptilian enlightened teachers would train others to explore their inner worlds, those who are here that are in the most difficult state of evolution are attempting to change the planet to their liking. So there are a great many influences, we would say, that exist on your planet today that are holding you back from realizing the true power of your energetic and physical structure as one. Even the close proximity of these reptilian beings to humans throughout time has changed the human DNA genetic dramatically, to the point where it's limited you in your access to certain DNA strands. It's made you more physically and materially focused. It's focused you into density and has caused, we'll say, a focus on physical creation or even energetic creation through the mind. And while certainly the mind is a very powerful part of the reptilian structure and is for humans, humans are not meant to create through the mind alone. The entire suite of extra sensitive abilities must be activated and used in concert. And this is the part of you that has been hidden. So what we're distinguishing here is the difference between the Naga, or those known perhaps more throughout ancient history as enlightened teachers, and other reptilians who have been here in very dire straits, who are not faring very well on a physical planet, but using tactics to make it their own.
Is it reasonable to say that those reptilians or Naga who originated the spiritual teachings we still follow today, such as meditative practices or pranic breathing or yoga, for example, that those teachings were initiated for benevolent purposes for the advancement of human beings? Or was some of that also done for control of the human genetic and also to direct more of human energy to empower these particular reptilian beings?
Well, you can easily see how it could have been both and has been both a part of your history. There has been benevolent and malevolent focus in these areas. It is not to say that all meditative practices and yogic teachings were offered for the benefit of the humans who received them. Some of these have even been interpreted through humans and changed very dynamically from their original presentation. But if we are taking the focus of the mind, we think it is an important consideration to look at how manifestation has been taught in a third dimensional reality. We believe much of this is reptilian in its focus. it does not necessarily mean that manifestation being taught through the mind is malevolent, but it is not the full application of your possibility. And it has been lowered in its vibration to assume that a soul must only satisfy itself with no consideration of the other. It has been brought through the filter of ego. And because of this, what we call reptilian consciousness has actually started to thrive within humans in very unnatural and egoic ways, where they are attempting to manipulate the laws of the universe in their favor with no consideration for an entire race or planet at large. And this has a lot to do with energetic siphoning, because anytime a soul is very egoically focused or singularly focused, they are not tapping in to a wellspring of energy and a matrix of vibration that is here to support the whole. It is why hierarchies still exist on your planet today, and a few are slighting the many. It is not because the few know more than you. It is because the many have been trained to break apart a very valuable energetic connection that is meant to sustain all.
Now, we discussed earlier about how the Naga tended to prefer areas of more solace, and they chose mountaintops and also underground. Another interesting archaeological phenomena seems to be, in particular in places like India or Ethiopia, there are some ancient civilizations who built sites or cities that were carved into the earth, so into rock beds. It seems as if they carved the entire site. For example, Kailasa Temple in India appears to have been carved entirely into the ground from one solid piece of rock, or even some temples in other parts of that region or regional countries in that area. Was this also the Naga that did that?
This is a Naga influence, yes, mainly for the reasons that we have already stated, because any inner earth chamber is going to hold a resonance that is very conducive to their vibrational needs. It is also very purposeful in healing humanity, because the inner earth holds very intense and pure vibrations that can be tapped into if a structure has been architected or designed in a specific way. We want to remind you of how these temples were so ornate and carved with stories, for example, having Akashic relevance. Much of this can also be seen in some of these inner earth chambers well beneath the ground, where souls would rest for days at a time and receive an infusion of light. For it is not only the pyramid connecting to the universe that is most important in transformation. Earth herself is one of the most powerful portals and gateways to universal energy. So this was a consideration in the choosing of these various locations, where, of course, very important ley lines and magnetic grids existed.
Well, you mentioned how the difference in technological use with the reptilians or Naga was that they used more of the inner technology, whereas the Anunnaki used external technology. Much like today, we may use different kinds of electronic devices as an external technology, right? Now, how did they carve out an entire site or city inside of in a very large piece of rock without any external technology?
Much of this was done using sound and light, and very similar to how some of the pyramids were constructed that we have explained previously. But it was not always the occasion of a light ship coming in and using an ornate temple through which light and sound was injected. Sometimes the Naga, for example, had the ability to use their own energy and vibration to visualize what it was they desired to create collectively, such that the design would come to full fruition. Meaning, alchemy happened through a vehicle of consciousness, and that energy was brought in from the cosmos to the earth to actually change entire landforms. This is why, in these ancient times, you would see the perfect symmetrical cuts of stone that may not have seemed possible with the various tools of the age, because it was not a physical tool at all that created the result. It was using the harmonic and the sound of multiple souls in unison, meditating and chanting to create what had evolved. It is hard to accept, we know. Humans today could not believe such a thing could actually take place. And it was not a miracle, instantaneous manifestation by any stretch of the imagination. This sometimes would take years of dedication, where human souls would even come to observe the process and learn themselves how to contribute with their own vibration.
So it wasn't physically carved in the sense that if you were to physically carve a piece of stone, you would have the dust from the stone in the area. So they projected their mind through vibration, and did that mold the stone then, or was the stone that was there before that had to be removed, was it removed into the environment? What happened? How does the process work?
Well, let's first use a very simplistic example that we think many would understand. In today's reality, it is an unfortunate occasion that you are subjected to weather modification, for example, or technologies like HARP that are using energy and vibration directed at a specific geographic area to create a very specific result. These beings had the intelligence, the wisdom, and the energetic power to become the technology themselves, more for the benefit of what they were attempting to do. And this is why. And we could say that this also adds to the idea of the Annunaki using outer technology and the Naga using inner. You cannot create an inner earth temple of this magnitude through your own energy unless you are aligned in the highest intention of all, because the universe is supporting that endeavor. That is why perhaps technologies that are harming humans today exist outside of themselves, because there is no necessary interface with the laws of the universe. It is something operating beyond and perhaps in contradiction of those laws. But you're asking about the material. And we want you to remember that these beings were alchemists. They were able to change the properties of rock and gold and crystal into something completely different simply through the projection through mind. Now, all of the elements that were not needed in the earth formation still became a part of the structure itself. It was somewhat like an elemental elixir that was undetected in a physical sense. In other words, the alchemy of rock took the shape of what was needed, and all that was not needed became an immediate part of the environment around and within it. There was no detectable trace of anything that was left behind because it was all used as a part of the vibrational field in which the structure would remain. That is why simply stepping onto these properties or into these regions, many extra sensitive souls can feel a tremendous shift of vibration even before walking up directly on the site at all, because all that had been alchemized in the configuration of the structure still exists as energy surrounding it.
You mentioned that the Anunnaki and the Naga or reptilians did interact in this timeline we're in today, and as a result, some of that inner technology or outer technology might have blended together to produce new ideas or new ways of architecture. Would that be true?
It is true. It is yet unknown. And we want to add that we do not think that outer technology, in other words, has to be something that is always malevolently focused. We can go back in history and provide many examples of great inventors who lent their knowledge and skills to leave behind healing devices, for example. Yet, the intention of the beings that are creating the technology must always come into consideration, and the level of consciousness of those who will receive it is also a part of the equation.
Well, I guess what I'm specifically trying to understand is in some parts of the world, we see a very different kind of architectural design in ancient sites. For example, they use polygonal stone structures, meaning the stones were all kinds of odd shapes and sizes, and yet they fit together like puzzles. That doesn't appear to be, for example, the Egyptian pyramids were built in a much more even structure. Was that polygonal structure a reptilian construct?
Not necessarily. We see these structures more representative of technologies that would have been created on the planet outside of self, meaning they may have been generating a specific tangible sound that was vibrationally cutting through stone. But in every occasion, there was always a template that was used. So we want to speak to for a moment, to what a template is, because many would assume that a template is somewhat like architecture. There is a vision of the structure that we are going to create, and every inch is accounted for and perfectly measured. Yet that is not necessarily the case when it comes to the creation of these various structures. What the beings that were creating them were focused upon is the end result or the outcome, meaning what this structure would provide those who are apt to use it or to reside within it. And they allowed the universe to download the template for them. This means that if you were using a technology like cymatics or sound, you were working with universal energy to make the best cuts and orientation of stone that would fit together in a way that would create an end result. And sometimes this accounts for the very archaic looking structures that you see today that nonetheless fit together very perfectly in terms of the various shapes and cuts, but look quite different than what you might see in Egypt, for example, or in India. These templates were a bit different. Some of these were generated by light beings who were brought in to manifest the end result of what those on Earth desired. And a template could be formed as light. And through that light, sound was injected. And that sound changed the reality of the physical earth in which it was injected. So if we go back and we look at these structures individually, we're going to see many commonalities that are similar throughout these various timelines, but also slight differences as to which technologies were used how the templates came together and how the various properties of Earth were manipulated.
So these light beings that worked on these specific kinds of architectural projects, were they reptilian or Anunnaki or something else?
Many came from Orion, especially in the Egyptian age. Some of them from Lyra, many different locations, because the reptilians who were here, for example, those that had the benefit of the people in mind, had very conducive relationships in the astral. They sat on councils with many of these different cosmic families. So there were agreements that were made. Those that existed beyond the earth, especially those that had come at the very beginning and in the process of seeding humanity, had a vested interest in creating various technologies, we'll say, that would support the rerouting of the Earth's evolutionary process. And this was to raise dimension. It was to raise consciousness, a variety of different reasons.
You mentioned that the reptilians were shapeshifters, and now on Earth, they've taken various different forms, some that are reptilian and some reptilian human hybrid appearance. Were they, when they were on Draco, did they have the same forms, or were they more in a reptilian form or something totally different?
Well, most of the reptilians that came to Earth from Draco look very similar to what they do on Earth, with the exception that they could shapeshift from material into light at will. And even though this happens on planet Earth today and has in ancient civilizations, there's a slight difference in how this process takes place, because to shapeshift from physical into light, it requires a certain dimensional access, meaning beings are operating well beyond or into the fifth dimension, which we believe is a gateway to all dimensional energies. But because of the Earth's speed of vibration, it's a bit of a slower process, meaning to go from physical into another form may take a bit longer, could be an arduous process, may not result in exactly what this being had been hoping for. And there has been hybridization, as we have spoken of, with human beings and reptilians. And much of this has further slowed the process. So as we look at modern times and reptilian hybrids that still exist on the earth today, what we see is more of a human presentation than we actually do reptilian. If we go back into ancient times, we're seeing more a reflection of how they appeared in their own star system.
Okay, just to make sure I understand correctly, in the original seeding of humanity, at that time, the reptilians on Draco were in the 12th dimension. And what you're saying is, and I'm going to formulate some ideas, you can tell me if I'm on the wrong track. What you're saying is that at that time, because they were 12th dimensional beings, they were able to go from physical material to light. But when they came to Earth in the third dimension, they were not able to do that quite so effectively.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Now, in many ancient temples, in India in particular, they do show a lot of the gods and goddesses having humanoid from the waist up, for example, and like snake tails or reptilian snake bodies below the waist. Was this a literal depiction of how they appeared in ancient times?
Well, in many circumstances it was, and this is a result of the time-space lag that perhaps we are speaking of. So if in Draco, a reptilian could shapeshift from a physical form into light and then came to Earth and had to adapt to a different way of shapeshifting, it could be explained as moving from one form to another, where all that they had encountered was influencing the form in which they would hybridize to. And we think many of the depictions that you speak of are representative of this type of experience.
So when they were on Earth in ancient times, they preferred to present themselves in this sort of hybrid form, half human, half reptilian?
Well, some would prefer, and others simply hybridized in that direction because it was natural for them on a physical planet to do so.
Could they also appear as fully human?
Some can. It is dependent upon their level of evolution on the Earth, meaning every race, regardless of the planet upon which it finds itself, will fall into a evolutionary process adaptive to the planet itself, meaning how the reptilians would have continued to evolve on Draco was completely different to how they are evolving today.
And on Earth, in ancient times or in modern times, the reptilians, does it require a lot of energy? Is it taxing for them to maintain a human form or a half-human form?
Not necessarily, but at times it is dependent upon the situation. And this is where the idea of dimension can come into the conversation, because dimension is a deciding factor in how quickly, easily, or comfortably a soul is able to hybridize. In the third dimension, for example, many of you are not tapping into the fullness of your DNA that allows you to hybridize, not into forms unnatural to human beings, but into more of your crystalline properties or cosmic family abilities, which you're meant to express and also integrate. And this is similar to what has happened to the reptilians. For example, they are hybridizing and they're certainly shape-shifting, but it isn't always into the forms they desire or expressed in the results that they would want. It's a longer and more arduous process and is capped somewhat by the dimension that they are in.
Would it be reasonable to say that the majority of Indian gods, say Vishnu or Krishna and others, were reptilian?
They are very much hybrid reptilians, yes.
Okay. Would that be also true for Buddha?
Buddha does have the influence of reptilian genetics, but also was tapping into a multidimensional expression of his DNA.
Okay, but what were his family lineage reptilian?
Many were, yes.
Okay. So because he was perhaps a bit more ascended, he was tapping into multidimensional lineage, but physical lineage was reptilian then?
We can agree with that. And to say a lineage is physical only isn't necessarily satisfying the laws of the universe, because even on planet Earth, which is a more materially focused planet, a lineage is going well beyond the blood relatives before you. It is an infusion of every other cosmic being or family that you've ever been a part of before. And the Buddha was so enlightened that he was able to tap into parts of himself in other dimensions at will. And when you speak of shape-shifting, this is one of the highest forms of that, where a being is able to tap into the Akashic relevance, wisdom, and understanding of other parts of itself and bring it into the here and now to be utilized in a very effective way.
So could this be likened to, for example, many of us today are operating more fifth dimensionally, but we may come from family lineages that are still very much third dimensional?
Well, it is not necessarily that you are more third dimensional in your physical lineage. It is just what you have been focused upon and only what you are integrating. So we can speak to the DNA in a bit more detail here, because as third dimensional beings, you have been taught and believe that you are only operating in 3 strands of DNA. And those 3 strands of DNA are representative mostly of your blood lineage, your ancestry, and all of the physical patterns that you have been imbued with that you are here to somehow resolve. But that is only a very small part of who you are. There are other physical DNA strands which may represent ancient lifetimes on Earth, parallel timelines that you are still involved in or on, and even hybrid aspects of who you are on the physical Earth. And there is an entire suite of crystalline DNA that run parallel to the carbon strands, which are pulling, drawing from all of your soul's expressions throughout the cosmos. Now, the reason that those in the fifth dimension are hybridizing more than the third is that they have accessed beyond the third DNA strand. And the fifth dimension is a multidimensional gateway to universal energy. And this is why so many are beginning to realize extrasensitive abilities or to speak with cosmic families from beyond the earth. These are ultimately parts of themselves that have become active and are integrating within them to be expressed in a physical sense.
Now, you mentioned that, as just to sort of review, the reptilian race is more mind-focused, some more higher mind-focused, and many of these ancient spiritual teachings that many of us in the spiritual community even adopt today and utilize, such as meditation and pranic breath and so on, are coming from this reptilian lineage through various religions such as Buddhism or Hinduism and so on. But if you're saying that our real power is in the emotional axis and we've moved away from that, then is practicing these more Buddhist or Hinduist religious spiritual practices that are more focused on inner development, is that taking us away as human beings from our most powerful selves?
We believe that it is, but not in every occasion. So what you must always keep in mind is that the level of consciousness of the race that you have incarnated to become a part of is going to dictate how the Akashic records become accessed. What many are practicing in Buddhist teachings today, for example, is a magnetic draw from ancient times. There is a part of them that may have been reptilian or had become interested in that part of themselves. And that isn't necessarily wrong to explore something from before, because we are meant to integrate it into our present moment. Where we get concerned is that if we become too mind focused, meaning we are only trained to visualize what it is we want or need, or to satisfy our desires, to manifest from a state of thinking, we will bypass a beautiful part of the human structure that we've been calling the emotional body, which is actually your extra sensitive connection to universal energy, or what we call the divine. Because while in a reptilian being, the divine may run through a higher mind, in humans, it tends to run through the entire body, the entire structure. So if we are only thinking about what we need and what we do not have and focusing on it to manifest, we are missing out on what the universe is providing to us in each present moment, which may simply be a message about how we receive what it is we want, or may be a direction we are meant to head that has nothing to do with what we think we believe and we need. So we think there is some conflict here. In other words, there is a very massive reptilian influence that has become a strong part of your spiritual practices. And this may have been appropriate more in the third dimension because you've been operating in the third dimension in a linear and material fashion. So these teachings may have suited you more as the beings that you were. But you are now stepping into the fifth dimension, and you are reclaiming, we'll say, all of the inner technology that you have been blessed with from the beginning of time. And this includes deep feeling and processing of emotion to interface with the mind and the spiritual body as well. All of these things working in concert such that you realize everything has somewhat been taken care of. There is an intelligence to the process that you as universe has put into place for yourself. And we think these teachings, even some coming from the Naga themselves, have yet to fully be explored in the period of time that you exist. And they are not just reptilian in nature, obviously. The more you deepen into what you feel, the more you are going to release all of the trauma and all of the blocks that stand in the way of feeling itself. And feeling is a navigation for humanity to understand its path of salvation. For if everything is pre-planned and it is yet a mystery, all we have to go on is each present moment. And in Solace, this is what the Naga were attempting to reclaim themselves, because if they were too involved in the busyness and the mechanics of a mundane physical life, they would have been too interrupted in the mind to be clear enough to receive what it was they needed, taking each step in physical forward as it came.
All right, let me try to articulate in a very simple, basic way my understanding of what you just said, and you can tell me if I'm on the wrong track. So the reptilians focus primarily in the mind, and teachers who professed the teachings of that were teaching things like yoga, meditation, and breath of fire, things of that nature, or reaching a state of mind stillness, which also was taught by a lot of Greek philosophers, I assume, under the terminology of Stoicism, which essentially is the stillness of the mind and the not getting involved in emotion. So am I correct in assuming that is, if I were to sort of very simply articulate what the reptilian teachings were, that would encompass it?
We agree with what you're saying, yes.
Okay. Now, by contrast, let me try to articulate what you mean by emotion, which is different. So emotion might be, for example, if I were to look at a piece of art or let's say a child and just be amazed and feel the love and or joy or inspiration in that thing, or those are, when you say emotion, are those the kind of things that would fit into that category that reptilians by their true nature would not be able to experience?
We agree with what you're saying. Human beings are not here to think things into being. They are here to feel things into being. And that is a very prominent difference between reptilian beings and human beings, because if you are to bypass the very ornate and prominent emotional structure that you have been created within, then it is very easy for others to take hold of your creative energy. The mind is a very powerful part of your structure. Yet, if it is not used in concert with your ability to sense and feel, then you will always be scrutinizing things from a place that is not organic and true to your nature.
So feelings like enthusiasm, excitement, love, passion, those would be emotional qualities that are distinctly human.
Well, even sadness and fear, we do not think that these emotions are necessarily bad or wrong. But what happens when humans have been hijacked through the mind is that they are able to feel, but are often directed in the feeling, meaning those that are in control can access the mind to the point where stories become the norm, not necessarily what is real. And while everything that you experience is real and tangible, what we're getting at here is an organic process of manifestation that is your birthright, that you have always been oriented to. We could even call it preference. Humans are taught to use preference through the mind, to think about what it is they want and what it is they don't want. But in each moment, if you are to deepen into your emotion and you are to express that emotion organically, you will be clear enough to always know the way, because the emotion is going to be the GPS of your eternal life. And the mind is an accompaniment of that. Think of emotion in terms of vibration. This is what the original seeders had in mind when they architected the human structure. It is no less a template than anything that we have discussed in this transmission having to do with pyramids or technologies. The intention of the original seeders was to create a race that operated different than any other in the universe. And this is why feeling on a physical planet became the premise for many souls coming in to incarnate in physical vehicles that the seeders created, because it was never done before. Even though in star systems like Pleiades, for example, and even in Sirius, beings experience emotion, they have evolved to the point where that emotion does not interfere with what it is they are here to experience or create. And unfortunately, on planet Earth, there has been interference in that process. And that is why we are attempting to show you the difference in how creation takes place within you versus reptilians. You're not meant to think things into being alone. You're meant to feel everything to its deepest and highest degree. And through that experience, become something other than you ever were. Because what a soul truly wants is to not remember who it has been before, but to experience itself in a form that has never been. And that is ultimately the origin story of humanity. Many souls throughout the universe wanting to experience something that had never been before. But this evolutionary path has unfortunately been stolen from you. So feeling isn't something that has to get in the way. We see humans suppressing feeling. But feeling to the deepest level is going to make a physical and mental connection in a very spiritual way to the world around you. And this is where true purpose and fulfillment actually comes in. The enlightened Naga teachers, they were not necessarily here to focus humans on the mind, but distill the mind enough to allow those feelings to arise. And that is what you are going for ultimately in meditation, to be present with the world in a way that no other race throughout the universe is able to accomplish.
Now, we were talking about Buddha a while ago and how he was from a reptilian lineage. His parents and family were reptilian in nature. And if we go back to ancient times, in particular in that, India, Cambodia, that region, we see a lot of actual historical evidence of the kings and queens of ancient times having been from the Naga group or clan. In particular, in Cambodia about 2,000 years ago, there was a queen, the first queen of Cambodia was said to be a Naga, and her name was Soma. Was that true?
It is true, yes.
And Soma was said to be a leader of a group of pirates who were attacking human beings at the time. Is that true also?
Not necessarily a part of this story that we agree with.
Okay. She was said to have married an actual human male in the end and stayed with him for his life. Did that sort of intermarriage occur between Naga and human?
This was quite common during this period of time, and that is why you have seen so much hybridization as human beings. We don't necessarily believe it's a negative thing whatsoever. When we talk about hybridization, we know we have been speaking a great deal about the exclusion of emotions and the focus of mind, but The reptilian vibration is sometimes very pure and conducive to a human soul's own vibration.
So can somebody like Soma, for example, and her husband, can they procreate a child, even though they're from two entirely different groups of races?
Much of this was done in a tantric fashion. So you must consider that those that were hybridizing to this degree were not necessarily capable of a physical intercourse or interaction, but were so adept and trained at a tantric infusion, or we'll say exchange, that pregnancies did occur.
And the pregnancies that occurred, were they human or reptilian, or sometimes one or the other?
Of varying degrees.
I see. And does our knowledge of what at least what's passed down to us as Tantra, come from the reptilians, or does it come farther back in more ancient times?
So many different star systems throughout the universe and races on planets beyond the Earth have practiced Tantra in their own fashion. So what you see coming to Earth is a blending and we'll say a contribution of many different intergalactic hybrids who have used these techniques not only to procreate, that was not typically the purpose, but to sustain a balanced vibration.
And Buddha's case also, he came from a royal family, which I assume, a reptilian royal family similar to Soma. And so it seems like a lot of the ancient royalty, or even the concept today of kings and queens or royalty, it came from Annunaki too, it appears, but it seems to also have come from the Naga as well.
Very much so, especially on the planet Earth.
So why is it that these more enlightened Naga created these hierarchical structures where they were worshipped as royalty? I can understand why the Anunnaki did that, but why would a more enlightened race, although they were, as we discussed, third dimensional when they were on Earth, is that why?
That does account for some of the reason that we would offer, because in the third dimension, there is a bit more separation and ego, and it lends itself very well to a more hierarchical manifestation. Yet, you must also consider that some of the Naga, the more enlightened ones, did not set out to become worshipped. They were seen as enlightened teachers with great powers and sometimes even feared. So the humans on the earth that received their teachings worshipped them simply because they saw them as more powerful than themselves. And this continued to evolve through time.
And so in the case of someone like Buddha, who the story goes that he left his royal palace because he saw that humans were suffering, and so he went off on his spiritual quest. Now, is that because, was he born with this multidimensional aspect that caused him to take this different path, or was that something that just came as a natural progression of his genetic lineage?
Well, very enlightened beings who exist in a lower dimension still retain their multidimensional access. So imagine that a master like Buddha, for example, would be having an experience of suffering on a physical planet, but not necessarily affected in the same way as others were. Even though the Buddha had a tremendous amount of compassion for the human beings that existed in the timeline he was in, he was still evolving at a very rapid pace beyond them. So what you're speaking of here is something we would define as a timeline shift or even a timeline jump. Not even necessarily a decision that was consciously made, but a being manifesting into a different dimension because the one that he existed in was no longer conducive to his vibration.
Now, in his case, when he left his palace and his family environment and went off to pursue a spiritual life direction, I assume that considering he was also reptilian, the practices that he was teaching were also mind-based, such as meditation. Is that correct?
They were, but not in the same way as others, because every reptilian human hybrid or intergalactic being is going to translate the teachings a bit differently. In regards to Buddha, there was certainly a focus on the mind, and especially the higher mind, which is a connection of the pineal gland or the third eye. When the third eye is awakened through the very intricate and subtle connections that go through the mind, there is a consciousness expansion. And this was a part of his intention and his goals in his teachings were not only to still the mind, for example, or to find solace or quiet within the self, but to activate a sort of chemistry or innate process, because the pineal gland is not exclusive or separate of the other chakras. It is one of the most powerful chakras that when humans bring online will activate other sensory abilities and gifts. And this was immersed, we'll say, within his teachings.
Okay, on a side note, did Hinduism also originate with the Naga or the reptilians?
Some of the Naga provided the foundational teachings of Hinduism, but there is also a great deal of influence by other intergalactics, or we might say hybrids.
Okay, so for example, we talked about Vishnu being reptilian or many of the Indian gods, but um, you're saying some of the Indian gods might have been other collectives.
Yes, because during this time, and very much like other ancient periods, the enlightened ones who were practicing were activating parts of themselves from other dimensions, and it was very easy for them to infuse these parts with the whole. Vishnu, for example, was very adept at managing multiple timeline realities through his inner sight and physical perspective, meaning he knew of himself in other dimensions and the activities that were going on there. And he understood there was a relationship to those activities and what he was meant to do on the plane of Earth. And that is where he drew his great powers. So to say that he was only reptilian is to negate this powerful access that came very naturally to him and many others of his caliber.
So today, are we? Is it taking us farther away from our fullest potential if we're still practicing these teachings, such as of ancient Hinduism and Buddhism, that were originated by reptilian beings?
It is a difficult question for us to answer because we do believe there are many souls on planet Earth today that are meant to intersect with these teachings for a great purpose. For some, it may be to expose reptilian influences that no longer have a place on the earth today. And for others, it may be to take what was taught and to modify it, translate it, in other words, into modern day practices that are better suited for humanity. In other words, tailoring what was left behind to a brand new collective. At the same time, we know that many of you are growing out of the need to focus on mind at all, even though we know it doesn't feel that way in your physical bodies because the mind has been under attack. But sometimes when there are alternate technologies, for example, that are feeding the mind with programs, it isn't the best time to focus on mind-driven spiritual practices because these two things are in such conflict. And that is why we have been stressing all along the need to feel deeply, because the more that a soul feels, it will awaken out of some of the false programs that are being fed into the mind. And the way that humans have been taught to feel is actually putting a cap on their spiritual progression, meaning to feel for the purpose of self or to not feel, to exclude things from reality, has been more the norm. What reptilians have taught is to still the mind enough to allow the divine to flow through unencumbered. When we are in the present moment on planet Earth as a human being, and we're feeling in relationship to each present moment, the same thing happens. So we believe this is a period of emotional balance, which is ultimately the divine feminine within you, as well as embodiment, which is the bringing together of mind and emotion as one.
Well, how do you distinguish? For example, I'm sure a lot of people would say that emotion's a bad thing because, especially nowadays, there's a lot of violence and aggression and anger and wars on the planet, which are also emotional, I would think. There's a lot of suffering on the planet. So how do we distinguish between what you're describing as emotion and these other behavioral patterns?
Well, it is not that emotion is not the driving factor of the acts that you have brought to our attention. It is that the mind has been led to only focus on the negative aspects of human history. And for that purpose, these acts repeat. So it is like entering a library. If your mind was a library, but the librarian only directed you to the volumes of history that were sorrowful or fearful or evoked very uncomfortable emotions, you would come out of the library feeling very defeated and might even act out of those emotions because they were the only things that you knew. Suffering perpetuates on this planet because humans have been directed through the mind to a very limited human story. And he even have been focused into historic past timelines that reflect these negative emotions that impact a soul's desire to act out in very negative ways. And in fact, some of the Buddhist teachings having to do with awakening of consciousness were more relatable to what is now called emotional intelligence, which of the day may have been related to solace in itself, because when a soul is recognizing the emotion that it has, if it is an unnatural emotion that causes discomfort, it should be a warning bell that something is going on, a pattern that is repeating. It needs to be interrupted. But what consciousness allows a soul to do is bypass the librarian, to explore stories that it never knew existed, to even go back in time within its own history and bring in courage to understand where true joy comes from and who it is beneath all of the distortion. These are the things that we think are more important as you go forward in your evolutionary process. So no emotion is negative in our mind unless it becomes more the norm than any other. Because if you are here as human beings to feel into being, then to create a multidimensional earth of your desire, you must feel to the greatest degree, to the most diverse spectrum. And that requires that you are very aware of what you are feeling and why.
Well, it seems to me that most mainstream modern spirituality is based in Buddhism or Hinduism or some variation of those two, which obviously are very much mind-based. So what kind of practice would we do? Is it, first of all, is it fair to say that we should move away from that practice as a dominant part of our practice? For example, maybe not spend so much time on meditation and yoga and those kinds of practices.
Well, where we think these practices are very beneficial for humans is to develop the ability to become present or mindful. And that is what stilling the mind in a meditative or yogic practice brings into being. And that leads to a connection to your emotional body, because humans are suppressing emotion or activating unnatural or negative emotion because they are either in the past or in the future. And that is how easily the human collective mind has become hijacked. If the librarian can can direct an entire group of human beings into the past or into the future, where things exist that are either fearful or perhaps not even meant to be, then a lot of energy is wasted and there is little attention to what's going on within. What the Buddha was attempting to achieve was a state of connection to the inner world, to still the mind enough to feel what was going on beneath the surface. So even though there is some reptilian influence here, you can see that there was a combination of other influences involved as well. But we also acknowledge that many of these teachings and practices have been taken out of context and in many respects been hijacked by reptilian-like beings or consciousness for personal benefit, whether it be pride, ego, vanity, or money. And because of that, they are leading humans astray. The only way to negotiate with this as an individual being is to feel into where the practice is leading you in your personal life, because there should be an obvious connection to what you are practicing and what you are experiencing in your life. It matters not whether you are having challenges that you are presented with, but how those challenges are faced is the deciding factor. So emotion can come about, but how we express that emotion and the message that it brings to us, we think are the missing points in many of these teachings, because it is assumed that we should be still and not feel. But if we miss out on the feeling, we will never know ourselves in the process.
Well, it seems obvious that we have many examples of spiritual practice to become more reptilian in the sense of developing the mind. But I don't see a lot of evidence of spiritual practice in developing the emotions. So what would be some of the mechanics of that? For example, would you surround yourself with things that make you inspired, or do things that get you excited or to feel emotion? What would be a good mechanical or practice of emotional development?
Well, something that we notice human beings have a hard time doing is being in the body, because the body represents discomfort, sometimes pain, or it is an analogy of our self-expression into the world, meaning it is something we have to control or present in a light that is acceptable. But to truly be in the body is to feel to the highest degree. So what we suggest between your various meditative and spiritual practices is to really get grounded into physical reality and the physical body, to be present with every activity and to take one activity at a time as slowly and deliberately as possible. This is like a moving meditation within itself, where we don't have to have profound astral experiences or cosmic interaction to actually gain something. We begin to witness ourselves as that astral and cosmic being that we desire to interface with beyond the veil. And that is where we think emotion can truly blossom in its most real state. Now, those of us who are here speaking on behalf, for example, of the Naacal or the Council of Light, have transitioned to a 12th dimensional reality. And in order to do that, we have been taught that emotion is the way, meaning that we have to feel everything that comes into our experience such that we are able to move beyond it. And this is a technique of higher consciousness, where we can become so intimately aware of what we feel in a physical sense that the feeling does not define us. It begins to become a message as to how we are defining our reality. And that is where the value truly lies, because if a soul has carved out a path long before it has incarnated in a physical body, that path is something that can be manifested into higher and higher octaves of vibration. And what we are going for is not to evolve beyond the circumstances that we do not desire or that are uncomfortable, but to evolve within and through them. And that takes a certain level of perception where we can feel whatever it is that we feel, but we're so in tune with the feeling that we guide it as opposed to it ruling us. We think this is where some of the more enlightened Naga were leading with these mindfulness practices, but they may not have been fully developed enough for humans today to reap the rewards or the advantages of. And we think even today, modern teachings of universal law have been somewhat skewed through a more reptilian consciousness, where souls are taught to feel something that they do not feel at all. If there is pain, they are asked to feel the opposite. If there is loss, they are asked to feel the opposite, such that they manifest a reality where the pain no longer exists, where the loss is no longer present. But we think this is a complete deviation from how you were designed, because if you do not go through the emotion to understand who you are, you will never become who you were meant to be.
And now, is this because the reptilians back then, when these teachings were initiated, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, they were incapable of feeling, so they couldn't really teach human beings how to use that as a tool?
Well, from a very wide vantage point, what we might say is, even though these enlightened teachers, many of them had the highest intentions for the students that they were teaching, they were also inhabiting a planet that they were trying to make their own. In other words, Earth was not meant to be their home, and their home had been destroyed. So these teachings were creating a path of more comfort and peace for them, but perhaps not necessarily the full picture of what humanity was capable of becoming.
So was there interest in teaching human beings these mindfulness practices, although maybe somewhat benevolent? Was it really to make the society of the planet more like them, more reptilian, so that they were more comfortable here?
Yes, absolutely.
And to this day, would that be true?
It is still true. Yet what we've seen is again a huge deviation from many of these ancient Naga or enlightened teachers, where human souls today are assuming these positions and taking these reptilian ideas to an even higher level.
So what would a reptilian being, for example, if we were as human beings to experience the emotion of love or joy, how does a reptilian being interpret those kinds of emotions if they don't feel emotions? Do they not experience love or joy? So let's say in a coupling between two reptilian beings, what is their definition of what that is?
Well, those that have evolved through the 12th dimension truly no longer need to distinguish between different emotions. They are typically in a perpetual state of bliss or joy, simply because they are connected in unity or in oneness. There is no need to establish individuality other than to contribute to the whole. So in a coupling situation, you can see how easily a human's connection can be made in perfect masculine and feminine balance. It is not that there is no feeling, but that feeling is always a reflection of the enlightenment of the two that come together as one. But as the reptilians inhabited Earth, remember, they went from a more 12th dimensional reality to a third or sometimes even a fifth. And because of this, their emotional bodies were taken into an even lower state. So they have somewhat a connection to emotion because they had traveled through time and space and evolved beyond it. They understand what it is. But on planet Earth, we're not used to working with it or having to feel it. But nonetheless, many of them have begun feeling it anyway, because in close proximity to humans, they have hybridized to the point where emotions confuse them today. So the original humans that were seeded were given an emotional body for a very specific purpose. As the reptilians came to Earth, they hybridized with that emotional body to understand humans better, but to not necessarily have to feel the emotion within themselves. The more enlightened ones were in a state of bliss or compassion with no need to feel suffering, for example, or dismay or argument, because they didn't see themselves as separate of another. These lower vibrational emotions that you feel, that we've said are not necessarily bad because they evolve you, are not something that reptilians necessarily need to deal with anymore. They see themselves as one, but on a physical planet have now become separate and are very confused. So emotion does happen within reptilians, but to varying degrees. And it is still something that isn't necessarily accepted nor embraced, and can cause them a great deal of confusion.
Many of our world leaders today appear to have no emotion. They seem very cold and calculating, without thought, can declare war and destroy entire livelihoods of people, and seem to make decisions very comfortably on that level. Now, are they reptilian hybrids that are in some way appearing as human beings, or are they just simply tapping into the reptilian consciousness more than the rest of us?
Well, it is both. At some of the upper levels, we'll say, of government agencies, those that are in the highest positions of power, you are looking at a true hybrid blood lineage. These are hybrid human reptilians who present themselves more in a human fashion, but also to some degree may have the ability to shapeshift. There are many others who come into government positions in various agencies who are not reptilian by nature, but because a consciousness exists in that space, are influenced nonetheless. It is not to say that every human in a government position becomes reptilian, but just like those on Earth who began to feel were very confused, those who have good intentions also become somewhat influenced and confused by others in positions of high power, or they're simply unable to do the work that they were set out to do because there is no ability to move it forward. So we think it is somewhat across the board. However, there is a very prominent race, or we'll say group, of reptilian hybrids that have continued on in government positions who still retain power today.
And so you said by proximity to human beings, they are becoming more human or more emotional. Would that be true for even these individuals you're speaking of?
To varying degrees, and many of those in prominent positions of power are having a taste of what it might be like to fear, because they have become very vulnerable themselves. Although it is assumed they are in powerful positions and somewhat succeeding in their endeavors, keep in mind that this reptilian lineage is not a very strong one that is well surviving. So there is a time frame, we believe, in which important change has to be made on this planet to retain a level of control. And we believe that the feeling of that is certainly tangible within many.
Well, in previous conversations, we talked about how there's a blood lineage of the Annunaki to modern times and world leaders, but we're now talking about how there is a reptilian blood lineage too. So which is it, or can you help me understand that concept?
Well, what you're seeing in the timeline, we believe, is an Anunnaki influence that has fused or somewhat merged with this reptilian lineage. Because remember, there was a crossing of timelines eventually in which these beings both contributed to each other's endeavors and also fought wars. But from an Anunnaki perspective, what we want you to keep in mind is that the genetic preclusion to Anunnaki is preservation of the DNA of the race from which they come. And this is not exclusive only to the Anunnaki, because you have a reptilian race that is focused on the very same thing. So often in high positions of power, there is more of a tangible connection to the Anunnaki history, the legacies they have left behind, the various techniques, technologies, and teachings that they have used. But the energy of the beings in power we'll say, more reptilian in nature. It is much like every human being that exists on planet Earth today. You all appear very unique in your presentation. You are all tapping into a predominant cosmic and also earthly lineage. This is going to be different for every human being. Yet, the very few at the top, we might say, have been influenced from both of these legacies or generations, the Anunnaki as well as the reptilians.
Now, by that, do you mean that they interbred between the Anunnaki and the reptilians, and those bloodlines, because they're intermarrying throughout generations, are still pure to those two original groups?
We can certainly take you back to a period of time when this was the intent, meaning the Anunnaki and the reptilians set out to create a hybrid being that carried the most, we'll say, the best and most prominent aspects of who they were on a planet in which they were not meant to fare well. And this is certainly seen in the combination of the genetics of those in power. Yet some associate more with one than another.
Okay, but from a purely physical genetic lineage, they originated as a coming together of both of these races of beings who interbred, perhaps, in ancient times.
Perhaps what we can say is that the carbon DNA or the physical DNA is more representative of an Anunnaki race or family, where the crystalline or the vibrational aspect of these human souls carry a reptilian connection.
Okay, this kind of goes back to our earlier conversation about how the Anunnaki focused on more external technology and the Naga or reptilians were focused on internal technology, and the genetics still are true to their lineage today then.
Yes, we agree.
Okay. All right, well, we're going to wrap it up there for today, and we'll continue the conversation next time. Thank you, Micheila.
All right.
And thank you all for joining us again for another Channel Revelations. We'll see you next week for another Awaken Empowered podcast.